Joseph Campbell famously said that what we're looking for in this life is not the meaning of life, but the experience of being alive. And Campbell talked about myths that help us enliven and enrich that experience, and enliven our traditions, and myths that help people with their religious ideals and with their religious icons and beliefs, even dogma. And he talked about the power of myth as being a very valuable resource for us as we move through now the 21st century. But myth may be very useful in helping us deal with the supernatural, with the metaphysical, with the unreal. But when it comes to dealing with reality, with the workaday world, and facts, it's not very useful to engage in myth. Because if we engage in myth to delude ourselves, to avoid facts, to think that things are better or different than they really are, that is not particularly helpful. One of the things that helps us with this experience of life is relationships. Relationships, of course, with people, with our friends and family and loved ones, and people that we come in contact with in our daily lives. But we also have relationships with our animal brethren with whom we share this planet. Some of whom, or many of whom, we don't see. They're roaming the polar ice caps, if there's any ice cap left. They're on the savannas of Africa, or right here in our own Sonoran Desert. And many of these animals we rarely see, so we have a somewhat tenuous relationship with them, perhaps. But it's a relationship nonetheless. Doesn't the interdependent web of existence come to mind? We're all related. All living things are interdependent. And then we have our domestic animals, those animals that have been spoken about this morning, that obviously give such pleasure and meaning to our lives and provide companionship. And also give, we're told, unconditional love. Now, I sometimes wonder about this unconditional love. When I look at my dog, I'm not certain that the love she's giving me is totally unconditional. I have a feeling there's some conditions attached to it. And then there are the other class of animals that we never see. These are the animals that are born into captivity, born into what are euphemistically called intensive agricultural operations, but which we know by the term factory farming. Now, these animals are born to the tune of 55 billion a year. 55 billion animals are born into this involuntary servitude. And this figure of billion we hear talked about so much, we really don't know how much it is. Well, I'll tell you. 1 billion seconds ago, the first atom bomb hadn't been exploded. 1 billion minutes ago, Christ was still alive. And 1 billion hours ago, we were in the Stone Age. So 55 billion of those are born each year. And 19,000 of them are slaughtered over what period of time?
Every second.
Is it a week, a month? We're told it's 19,000 a minute. Maybe it's a second, Marion?
I think so.
let's say it's, for the sake of argument, a minute. At least 90,000 a minute. And they are slaughtered purely for our pleasure, for our eating and tasting pleasure. They're slaughtered so that we, a population that's already overfed, overweight, overindulged, and out of shape, can continue to make ourselves ill. Now, you've heard from this pulpit before about the inhumane slaughter of cattle. Let's think for a moment about another aspect of factory farming, and that's the dairy industry. Now, isn't it a wonderful country we live in when we're able to go into a supermarket at any hour of the day or night and buy gallons of milk off the shelves? There's no shortage of milk, apparently. And have we ever asked ourselves the question, how is that possible? How is it possible that at any hour of the day or night, in major metropolitan areas certainly, we can find milk? Well, in order for this quantity of milk to be produced, dairy farms have to keep cows in a constant state of lactation. And they do this by forcibly impregnating them in a not very pleasant way. And when the calf of the cow is born, can we allow that calf to suckle at its mother's teat? No, because we humans have to have that milk. So that calf is sent away for slaughter and made veal out of. And then, when that has happened, the cycle starts all over again. When the cow has produced enough milk, they're forcibly impregnated again. And this goes on and on until these cows that should normally have a happy life of 15 to 80, 20 years are dried up after 6 or 7 years. And they're sold for slaughter. So at birth, the calf is forcibly removed from her mother. And witnesses say they hear the mother and the calf crying out for each other. Can you imagine anything worse than a child being removed from its mother? So we might ask, by what right do we do this? By what right do we exercise dominion and control? Do we dominate and subjugate another species merely because they're weaker than we are and because we want to eat them? Is this a religious concept? Is this a Christian concept? What would Jesus say about that? What would Buddha say about that? What would Allah say about that? Do you think that this is something that they would support, that they would think is a right way to live? No, they wouldn't think it's the right way to live. They say something's wrong. Jesus would say something's wrong. Jesus said faith, hope, and charity. And the greatest of these is charity, which has come to be known as love. And what about our Unitarian Universalist religion? What do we say about it? Is that really in keeping with our values to treat living sentient beings in this way? And the irony of this milk production and our consumption of milk is that this milk is poison. There's no other species that drinks milk from a species other than its own. Human beings are the only ones that do that. And the main protein in milk is called casein, and it has been proven to be carcinogenic by another gentleman named Colin Campbell, who wrote a book about it. He did 27 years of experiments and research, and he proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that feeding his laboratory mice animal protein caused tumors. And it even caused tumors when he fed them a huge amount of a known carcinogen. He fed them the highest tolerable amount of the carcinogen. Even with that high amount, they didn't grow tumors unless he gave them 20% in their diet of animal protein. When he dialed it back to 5%, the tumors went away. Dialed it back up to 20%, the tumors grew. 27 years he did this. So he was convinced there was absolutely no doubt that animal protein causes cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and other illnesses. So we're poisoning ourselves. Everybody knows that red meat is bad, right? I mean, I don't think anybody thinks that red meat is healthy anymore. We've known that for years. There's not a week that goes by without another article in the newspaper or story in the news about the ill effects of meat. There's another beef recall just last week. So this is a fiction. The idea that animal protein is good for us, the idea that milk is good for you, it's a fiction that's fed us by agribusiness. It's a fiction that those celebrities with the milk mustaches, they should be ashamed of themselves for foisting on us. Because these animals are animals that we are dominating and subjugating and killing. These are animals who, guess what? Want to give us unconditional love too, but they're never given the chance. So where does this idea come from? I think it has something to do with manifest destiny. Remember manifest destiny, under which the West was settled? It kind of goes together with the doctrine of discovery, which is something Chuck Tatum's been talking about. The idea that we, when we moved inexorably westward, had the right to conquer, subdue, eat, destroy everything in our path, where the buffalo hunters would go out, and in one day, one buffalo hunter would kill 60 buffaloes, just one guy. So this has become embedded in our culture. It's become an American right, to some people's way of thinking, a Christian right. We're more powerful. We who are powerful have the right to dominate those who are weak, whether they be humans or animals. And it's religious, and it's political. It's so political that even people at the highest levels of our government cannot bring themselves to admit that maybe there's something wrong with what's going on. You know, a few years ago when Sonia Sotomayor, that wise Latina, was undergoing confirmation hearings before Congress, she had to defend the Second Amendment, what I call the right to kill amendment. She couldn't show for a moment that she had any doubt about supporting it. And so she said, I have friends who are hunters. Well, Sonia Sotomayor lives in Greenwich Village. Have you ever been to Greenwich Village? You've seen the pickup trucks with the gun rats driving around there, probably. So it's embedded, this idea of hunting and killing and eating. And something's wrong with this. And there's some courageous people who've acted to their detriment on this knowledge that something was wrong. Courageous farmers like Howard Lyman, one of the most successful cattle ranchers, feedlot operators in the United States. He, by his own admission, was Mr. Agribusiness, and every day he'd get up, he'd have to feed his cattle antibiotics and hormones. Antibiotics, because a lot of them were sick, these cattle, when they came to him. The ones that survived the ride in the cattle cars, by the way, and weren't left to die by the side of the road like a lot of them are. And fed them hormones so that they could be fattened up to form what's called a kill package, so that we could eat them. And he'd spray insecticide down the feeding troughs every day. The fog of insecticide would lay in there like a blanket. And he knew something was wrong. And he really knew something was wrong when he woke up one morning and he couldn't move his legs. because of all those chemicals that we eat. In addition to the animal protein that's carcinogenic, we're eating and consuming the antibiotics that we need more antibiotics, right? We already have disease-resistant bacteria because of their overuse. So Howard gave it all up. And that term unimaginable suffering, which I was going to use earlier and I omitted to use, is Howard's phrase, unimaginable suffering. He knew it, he lived it, he experienced it. Another farmer, a young man named Harold Brown, had a similar experience. Harold Brown was raised in the farming culture. From the time he was a youngster, he was in 4-H, Future Farmers of America, and all of that. And he saw when these kids gave their prize pig or cow up for auction, this was supposed to be a celebratory time, he saw the expression on these kids' faces. They weren't happy. They didn't want to give up their cow or their pig because they knew what was going to happen to it. It was going to be killed. And this was a cow or a pig that had given them unconditional love. And Howard knew something was wrong. He started asking himself questions like, shouldn't what I do for a living be joyous? Shouldn't this farming life be a joyful experience? How can it be joyful when we're killing living things every day? Have you ever talked to anybody who worked in a slaughterhouse? Well, I have. Do you think these people are happy? Do you think they're proud of what they do? Do you think they go home and say, honey, I killed another 100 cows today. It sure felt good. If they do, they're psychologically sick. And some of them may, in fact, be to do that kind of work for their whole lives. There are other courageous individuals in the field of medicine. Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, for example. Dr. Esselstyn was a top cardiologist at the top cardiac care center in the country. Now, the top cardiac care center in the country is not in New York or Miami or Chicago or Tucson. It's in Cleveland. And he was the top cardiologist there, performing all these procedures, open heart surgery, shoving stents into people, shoving catheters into them, shoving balloons into them, performing angioplasty. And he asked himself the question, something's wrong here. I keep treating these patients, nobody's getting any better. Some of them come back again for repeat surgeries. And he started asking himself the question, why is it that 3/4 of the planet doesn't have any cardiovascular disease at all? Why are we the only ones that have it? In the industrialized world. So he started a study on his own of moving his patients to a plant-based diet. And he did this with hundreds of patients. He did it for years. And he found that not only did a plant-based diet arrest cardiovascular disease, but it actually reversed it. So he went to his hospital's administration after he was convinced, as Colin Campbell had been convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt, that diet causes cancer and cardiovascular disease. And he said, why not let us adopt this program? It's proven, it works. And they put him off, they gave him various excuses. And so finally, the chief of staff told him to talk to the head of cardiology. Well, he knew he didn't have to talk to the head of cardiology because the chief of staff could tell him to do it if he wanted to, but he was just copping out. So he talked to the head of cardiology, and the guy hung up the phone on him. They wouldn't even entertain the idea that prevention is better than treating a preventable disease. And Esselstyn was asked, why do you think that was? He said, look, these guys are whacking people open, doing bypass grafts on them, shoving stents in them. They've got the drama, the lights in the operating room. They're surrounded by nurses, scalpel, please, this and the other. It's a huge ego trip and a tremendously profitable income. And I'm going to come along and tell them, you can sell all this with broccoli and Brussels sprouts? You think they're going to go for that? No. So you know what he did? He started treating people out of his home. Treating patients out of his home with a plant-based diet. And he got together with other doctors who were similarly courageous, like John McDougall, who had similar experiences as Esselstyn did at other hospitals. And they actually take their patients to the supermarket and help them buy food. Can you imagine that? A doctor taking you to the market and telling you, this is what you should buy? So something's wrong. Something's very, very wrong with our society. And you know, if you rely on doctors, if you think they're going to cure you when you get sick, it's a sad mistake. That's a myth. That's a myth you do not want to pursue, with all respect to any doctors. You know, 225,000 people a year die from medical care. It's the third leading cause of death behind cancer and heart disease. It's hospital infections, it's unnecessary surgeries, it's partial procedures. And 106,000 people die a year from taking prescription drugs exactly as they are prescribed. Imagine that. And you know it's illegal because of the pressure from the pharmaceutical and other industries. It's illegal to treat cancer, for example, in this country with anything other than chemotherapy or surgery or radiation. You can be arrested. You can be criminally prosecuted if you try to treat it some other way. These treatments we have for cancer, by the way, that everybody gets, chemotherapy, radiation, you know how old those treatments are? 100 years. Since 1913, we've been using those treatments. There's been no advance. In 1971, Richard Nixon declared a war on cancer. $300 billion have been spent on the war on cancer since 1970. Has it made any difference? No. You know, the death rate from prostate cancer is exactly the same as it was in 1930. So do you want to wait to that point? Do you want to wait to the point that you're sick, that the doctor gives you that dreaded diagnosis? You kind of walk out of the room and say, oh, I want to turn the clock back. I want to change that. Can we rerun the tape? No, ain't going to happen. So these diseases have come to be known as diseases of affluence. They're diseases that we have because, as Colin Campbell said, we eat like feasting kings and queens, 3 meals a day sometimes. So what's good for the animals is good for you. If you don't want to do it for the animals, do it for yourself. But if you don't want to do it for either the animals or yourself, how about doing it for the environment? Animal agriculture is an environmental disaster. It creates more greenhouse gases than all the transportation in the world. Planes, trains, ships, automobiles. All of them put together don't produce as much greenhouse gases as animal agriculture does. The Unitarian Universalist National Animal Ministry says, humanity's dominion over the fish, the fowl, and the animals implies responsibility. And responsibility implies compassion. And what do our great Unitarian Universalist traditions say about our values in this regard? Well, the Reverend David Bamba, who John Clark quoted from this very pulpit some few weeks ago, said this. I'll remind you of it in case you haven't memorized it already. In his Declaration of Liberal Religion, we believe that all living things are members of a single community. All expressions of a planetary process that produced life and sustains it in intricate ways beyond our knowing. We hold the life process itself to be sacred. Amen.